2 weeks ago, the impossible happened. In less than 3 hours, US forces had entered Venezuela, extracted the head of the Venezuelan dictatorship, Nicolás Maduro, and his wife, Celia Flores, and taken them to New York to face trial for corruption, drug trafficking, and narco-terrorism. Almost no one, inside or outside Venezuela, believed that something like this could ever happen. The shock of Maduro's capture has rippled across the world. Many have questioned the US government's actions. Others wonder what this means for global peace and security. But for Venezuelans, who have lived under Maduro for more than a decade, this moment is far more complicated. There's joy. Real, unfiltered joy. The kind that comes from knowing that the man responsible for so much suffering is finally sitting in a jail cell, powerless, finally being brought to justice. But there's also fear and frustration, because the Venezuelan regime is still in place. The institutions that uphold the dictatorship remain intact, and ordinary Venezuelans continue to live in uncertainty, despite US claims that it's working towards a transition. But for many Venezuelans, the hardest part about this moment is having to explain why this moment matters at all. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that takes over when Venezuelans are confronted by people who have never lived the Maduro regime, yet suddenly feel very confident about debating it. People who reduce Venezuela to arguments about oil, sovereignty, or Donald Trump. That frustration isn't intellectual. It's visceral. Because Venezuelans lived this. They've stood in 8-hour lines for food. They've watched friends and family flee the country or disappear into prisons. And they've seen protesters killed in the streets, dissidents tortured, and political opposition crushed over the course of 2 decades. So yes, it makes their blood boil to be lectured by people telling them that their joy is inappropriate, that whatever they feel is insignificant compared to the abstract danger of US interventionism. That anger comes from a deep personal pain. Imagine being forced into exile, watching your country collapse from abroad, and being surrounded by people who not only don't understand, but insist on arguing with you about it, who insist that you're the one being emotional, that you're the one lacking objectivity. That's the emotional context of this moment. So in this video, I want to explain why Venezuelans hate Nicolás Maduro, not as part of some ideological or political argument, but as consequence of how an entire country has systematically been broken into submission. But before we go any further, I need to pause for a second, because at this point, you're probably asking yourself, who is this guy? Why should I trust this random dude on YouTube to explain this to me? And that's a very fair and intelligent question. So let me quickly introduce myself. First, I'm Venezuelan. I was born and raised in Caracas. For my entire life, Venezuela has been governed by Chavismo. I didn't read about its collapse in a book. I didn't discover Venezuela on the internet. I lived it. I watched institutions hollowed out. I watched power concentrate. I watched my country descend into repression and dictatorship. That experience led me to study history at Stanford, and later international law at Harvard Law School, all in an effort to understand Venezuela better, to understand how a country falls apart, and how dictatorships survive. So, if you want to keep learning about Venezuela with context, history, and honesty, make sure to subscribe. Because this video isn't just about Maduro. It's about the system built around him, the crimes his regime have committed, and why Venezuelans reacted to his capture the way that they do. But before we can talk about Maduro, we need to talk about Hugo Chávez. Now, this video is not about Chávez, so I won't go into too much detail. I'll be making more videos about him in the future, so you can wait for those. But for now, all you need to understand is that by the time he died in 2013, Chávez didn't just govern Venezuela, he had absorbed it. Chávez was president for almost 13 years. Over more than a decade, he dismantled checks and balances, concentrated power around himself until every institution was bent to his will. The courts, the legislature, the military, every inch of the Venezuelan state was under his control. Judges who defied him were punished and imprisoned. Governors and mayors were stripped of power if they opposed him. Elections still existed, but they were systematically tilted in his favor, using state money, coercion, and institutional manipulation. That political concentration was matched by an equally disastrous economic project. Starting in 2007, Chávez launched a policy of mass expropriations that devastated the Venezuelan economy. More than 1,000 companies were nationalized across nearly every essential sector of the economy: telecommunications, electricity, oil services, and most critically, agriculture and food distribution. And let me be very clear, because I know some people watching this will be inclined to idolize Chávez just because he called himself a socialist. But here's what actually happened. Private companies were not replaced with worker-owned enterprises. They just became state-run companies staffed by political loyalists, often with no management experience whatsoever. Even under leftist political theory, that's not socialism, that's state capitalism riddled by corruption and incompetence. And the economic consequences were catastrophic. Production collapsed, business incentives vanished, and expropriated factories became graveyards of broken machinery and unpaid workers. And this mattered most in agriculture and food production. The Chavez government had taken over essentially the entire food supply chain in Venezuela. When those companies collapsed, massive shortages of food and basic goods followed. To address the problem, Chavez tried to bridge the gap by importing everything, financed by the largest oil revenues in Venezuelan history. In other words, mass expropriations destroyed domestic production. To cover up the damage, the government imported food and basic goods and sold them at a loss, heavily subsidized by oil money. But that only works as long as the oil money flows. When oil prices dropped, the system imploded. But here's the thing. By the time oil prices collapsed, Chavez was already gone. By the time he died in 2013, Chavez left behind a country hollowed out institutionally and economically, but very tightly controlled. He had built an authoritarian infrastructure capable of surviving him, and when he disappeared, the men and women around him inherited it. On December 8, 2012, Chavez appeared in public for the last time. The address lasted 35 minutes, but it decided Venezuela's future. Standing beside him were Nicolás Maduro and Diosdado Cabello, the two men who would inherit the Venezuelan state. Chavez spoke carefully, but the message was unmistakable. If he did not return from his cancer treatments in Cuba, there was only one acceptable successor.
Mi opinión firme, irrevocable, absoluta, total, es que en ese escenario ustedes elijan a Nicolás Maduro como presidente de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela. Yo se los pido desde mi corazón.
Nicolás Maduro had been formally anointed as Chávez's successor. The next day, Chávez flew to Cuba, and he was never seen in public again. After 3 months, it was finally announced that Hugo Chávez had died, triggering new presidential elections in April 2013. For the regime to survive, though, Nicolás Maduro had to win. But Maduro was not Chávez. He lacked his charisma, authority, and emotional grip on the country. In truth, Chavismo had never been a coherent ideology. It was a personalistic movement built around Chávez himself. His supporters called themselves Chavistas, not Socialistas. And without Chávez, the entire political movement was suddenly very fragile. Because there is no Chavismo without Chávez. That's why Maduro's campaign leaned entirely on Chávez's memory. The election was rushed, held while the country was still officially in mourning, and Chávez's face, his voice, even his handwriting flooded state television and billboards. The message was simple and relentless. Voting for Maduro was voting for Chávez. At the same time, for the first time in over a decade, the opposition believed victory was possible. The opposition candidate was Enrique Capriles. Just 6 months earlier, Capriles had lost to Chávez by a wide margin in the 2012 presidential election. This time, turnout was massive. Nearly 80% of Venezuelans voted in the Maduro-Capriles election. And then, before midnight, the Electoral Council announced the result. Maduro had won by the slimmest margin imaginable, roughly 200,000 votes more than Capriles, a single percentage point. Capriles and the opposition demanded a full recount, citing thousands of irregularities, intimidation, and abuses of state power. For many Venezuelans, the margin was simply way too narrow, and the system too compromised to be considered credible. But within days, and despite protests, the institutions Chávez had spent years bending to his will closed ranks. The Electoral Council declared that the results were irreversible. The courts rejected all appeals, and Maduro was sworn in as president. The transition itself was over, but the wound never healed. The refusal to conduct a comprehensive recount only deepened suspicions that the election had been stolen. From the very beginning of his mandate, Nicolás Maduro governed with fragile legitimacy, without consensus, and without Chávez. And to survive, he would come to rely on repression and fear. When Maduro was officially elected president in 2013, Venezuela was already sliding into an economic emergency. Poverty was now higher than when Chávez first took power. Whatever gains the government claimed over 13 years were wiped out almost immediately in Maduro's first year. By 2013, inflation had already soared past 50%. Food shortages turned chronic. Basic products, milk, eggs, sugar, rice, flour, coffee, cooking oil, even toilet paper, vanished from the shelves. Daily life in Venezuela became a constant struggle to find food, as Venezuelans waited in hours and hours in lines at supermarkets. Faced with this crisis, the Maduro government blamed everyone except itself. Businessmen, the opposition, foreign sabotage, CIA conspiracies, an economic war. But the shelves weren't emptied by enemies of the state. They were empty because the economic system Chávez had created was collapsing. As I already explained, hundreds of companies in agriculture and food production that Chávez had expropriated, along with the millions of hectares of farmland that went with them, were so mismanaged that they went into bankruptcy, and local production collapsed. Chávez papered over the damage with oil money, importing food on a massive scale, but that only worked as a temporary solution. By the time Maduro took office, Venezuela was importing roughly 70% of what it consumed. The country could no longer feed itself. Its survival depended entirely on oil dollars continuing to flow in order to subsidize the import of food. Then, the money ran out. In 2014, oil prices collapsed from over $100 a barrel to nearly $40 in a matter of months. Government revenue was cut in half, and the state printed even more money, accelerating the spiral. By the end of 2014, inflation reached nearly 70%. Food was scarce, medicine was scarce, and public anger was boiling over. At the same time, the Chavista elite was stealing billions of dollars from the Venezuelan state, accelerating the collapse and stripping institutions of their capacity to even respond. Within a year of Maduro taking office, the economy was collapsing, and violent crime was completely out of control. Venezuela was no longer just poor or unstable, it was becoming dangerously ungovernable. When corruption becomes the norm, organized crime doesn't just survive, it thrives. Everyone was for sale. Police commanders, military officers, judges, government ministers, everyone. Under Chávez, Venezuela became the key transit hub for drug trafficking, with criminal networks operating with the protection of the Venezuelan state. Weapons flooded into the country, and by the early 2010s, millions of illegal firearms were circulating. Grenades, assault rifles, military-grade weapons leaking out of military stockpiles and into the hands of street gangs. Violent crime consumed daily life. Armed robberies, home invasions, and kidnappings became routine. Every Venezuelan knew at least one person that had been kidnapped or robbed at gunpoint. Crime became so widespread that people imposed their own curfews, afraid to leave their homes after dark. And the murder rate climbed year after year, while impunity soared, with more than 75% of murders left unsolved. By 2014, Venezuela was among the most violent countries in the world, and the state was completely absent or complicit. Police officers were underpaid, poorly trained, and deeply corrupt. In 2011, an investigation found that police participated in roughly 80% of kidnappings in Caracas. 80%. Maduro couldn't solve the crime crisis because his government was embedded in it. Instead of restoring order, the Maduro government cut deals with the gangs, agreeing to withdraw police from entire neighborhoods and hand over territory under so-called peace zones. The idea was simple. Police would pull out, and the gangs would just disarm. But that never happened. The police withdrew, but the weapons stayed. Gangs grew stronger and more entrenched, ruling entire communities through fear and violence. Rule of law no longer existed. Institutions had been captured. Military and police forces were actively involved in criminal activity. Crime wasn't a problem to be fixed for Maduro. It was a feature of the corruption networks that kept his regime alive. Within Maduro's first year as president, Venezuela was collapsing on every front. The economy was imploding, food was disappearing, inflation was spiraling, and violence was out of control. By early 2014, a lot of people, both inside and outside Venezuela, thought that the Maduro government had no chance of survival. That's the year of the first wave of anti-Maduro protests. It all began in the western states of Táchira and Mérida, where universities started protesting the country's increasingly unbearable conditions. And the regime responded with unusual brutality. Students were beaten, arrested, and in some cases transferred to prisons hundreds of miles away. That was the spark that caused the protests to spread. And it's important to note that from the beginning, this was largely a student-led movement. Young people organized marches, mobilized campuses, and kept showing up day after day. But everything changed on February 12th, 2014, Youth Day in Venezuela. That day, protests spread nationwide. In Caracas, thousands of protesters marched to deliver a letter to the Attorney General, demanding the release of the students who had been detained. After the rally, clashes broke out, and pro-government armed groups opened fire on protesters. Basil da Costa was the first to die. The 23-year-old student was shot on the head. Before he left the house that morning, he had left a note for his mother. It read, "Mom, I went to fight for the future of Venezuela. If I don't come back, I left with her." As images and news of Basil's death spread, new protests spread as well. And that's when 31-year-old Robert Redman was shot and killed in another part of the city. The tragedy of their murders struck a chord, especially because earlier that day, Redman had been one of the young men who had helped carry Basil da Costa's body to the hospital. To many, this seemed deliberate, as if helping Basil had marked him for death. That day marked a turning point. Anger spread and protests intensified. More students joined. Demonstrations spread to 16 of Venezuela's 23 states, and the government responded with deadly force, deploying security forces and pro-government armed groups known as colectivos. What followed was brutal, unprecedented repression. Security forces used live ammunition. Colectivos attacked protesters. Young people were arrested and taken to military bases where they were beaten and tortured. Over the following weeks, more students were killed. 22-year-old Genesis Carmona, 23-year-old Geraldine Moreno, 24-year-old Daniel Tinoco, most of them shot at close range. And it was the youngest generation of Venezuelans who carried the weight of that repression. Students who had grown up knowing nothing but crisis, who stood in front of riot police, soldiers, and armed paramilitaries with nothing but cardboard shields and stones. These protests didn't fail because Venezuelans didn't show up. They failed because the regime chose violence over reform. By the end of 2024, after months of protests, more than 23 people had been killed. Hundreds were injured, and thousands more were detained. And by the time the streets finally went quiet, one thing was clear. Nicolás Maduro had survived, but he had not won.